told you, as far as um, uncovering, always never be surreptitious. I was going to say that, used to occasionally, like, back in the day, there'd be undercover reporters who would use things like one time the Chicago Tribune or one of the Chicago newspapers, there used to be 11 or 12 of them, set up a fake bar in which they actually operated a bar for like 6 months. The newsroom did, because they wanted to learn about corruption in Chicago, and they wanted to get people to come in and give bribes and offer kickbacks, and get hustled by city officials. Oh, you're going to pull your liquor license if you don't donate to the alderman. Those kinds of things, and they did that because they wanted to be able to prove that. Now, that was a little bit of a gimmick. TV does that more now. Back in the day when that was done, that was 70, 80 years ago, there were 11 newspapers, there was no TV, and print media would do that kind of thing because they were trying to one-up their competition in the other newspapers. But by and large, you shouldn't do it. I mean, I don't know if they could have gotten that information elsewhere. Maybe it would have made sense to do it, but at least from the perspective of, you need to be very careful before you decide to lie or go undercover, before you use some sort of secretive or surreptitious method to get the information. Always be open, always be honest, because at the end of the day, you need people to know that when you come in there, the media is not out there trying to double trick them and cross them over and get the information without being honest and accurate. You need to be honest and accurate in the way you gather it, as you need to be, which is evidence to your honesty and accuracy in the way you give the information. Next is be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable. Give voice to the voiceless. There was a give voice to voiceless. Don't just tell the story of the powerful. It's really easy as a journalist. You are going to spend most of your day going to council meetings, meeting with business leaders, and doing things. You'll spend a lot. I wouldn't say most of your day, but you'll spend a lot of time doing that. You go to the courts and you'll talk to attorneys, and you'll talk to judges, and you'll talk to people of that, people upstanding, members of the community, leaders, right? And so it's very easy. These are people who are nice. That's part of how they got their positions. They know how to be nice to you. They're not going to, spit in your face typically. They're not going to be rude to you. They're going to be nice because they are trying to, get you to write good things about them. And so it's very easy to be swooed and swayed by that. And so you oftentimes will, be nicer to them. But the reality is that as a journalist, your job should be to hold those in power to account and give voice to the voiceless. You need to make an effort as a journalist to not get hoodwinked into believing those in power. Mike Royko was a Chicago Tribune journalist, was a columnist for like 30 years, wildly popular. Was popular in Springfield, all across the state of Illinois. People in Southern Illinois will still talk about him. Older people, sometimes if you say who Mike Royko is, oh yeah, he had this really good column, right? He was like kind of the people's journalist. He loved to go out and drink, and he'd sit in the bar and he'd tell stories about drinking, but he'd also write stories about things he learned about when he was out drinking from people who were working class people, who were like, my company keeps doing this and this, and he would tell their story, and he would hold those in power to account. He would go out and talk to people on the streets who couldn't get the hospital to hear their pleas. The other journalists were out there over the hospital doing healthcare reporting from the perspective of what the hospital is doing, but not from the patient's perspective. And so what happens is that we are, we oftentimes tell the story from the perspective of the hospital, but not from the perspective of the people going through the medical care. And that's, I think, one of these cases where, or we tell the story about the company, but not from the perspective of the worker. Your job as a journalist is to go and talk to those people who oftentimes don't have a place at the table. Tell their story. Let their story be told. So you need to be, and so what I was saying though about Royko was Royko said, I believe it was Royko who said, the job of the journalist is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. Your job is to take those who are comfortable, who have power, and hold them to account. Make their lives difficult. Be the little sand in the oyster that makes the diamond or makes the pearl. Be be the thing that kind of keeps them constantly to account. Not that you don't admire or respect or think that they can do a good thing, but you need to be holding them to account. Don't let them just do everything they want. Don't be their yes man. You are the people's voice, and your job is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. Somebody who's lost their child, somebody who has had a cancer diagnosis and can't get the answers they want from the medical community. Those who have lost their job, those are the people you need to speak for. And that's why sometimes I oftentimes kind of talk about being, I kind of joke around about being anti-police sometimes. I am not a cheerleader for the police. Okay? I am not a cheerleader for the state's attorney. I am not a cheerleader for the court system. I am not a cheerleader for any institution. As a matter of fact, I know people, and I can even tell you, from my own personal experience, that oftentimes those in those positions do not always give people a fair shake. They come in with their prejudices, with their preconceived ideas, and they treat those who are not in they treat them as criminals when they're not even criminals. I mean, I can tell you, having worked at a newspaper in a bad neighborhood, that I got pulled over at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, going home from work at midnight and 1 a.m. because I had to drive through the crappy neighborhood to get away from my workplace, to get back to my home, which was in a nice area. And what did they do? They would pull me over and be like, "What are you doing driving at night?" "I'm going frickin' home. That's what I'm doing." And so then what happens is I would get pulled over once in a while, but I mean, people who live in those neighborhoods, they get pulled over every week, every month, every 2 or 3 months. I'm a white guy dressed nicely, sober, going home from work. I'm not up to any trouble. And they would quickly go, "Oh, okay, Mr. McKenzie, we'll get this done quickly, but you do know you were going half a mile over the speed limit." I didn't frickin' know it. No, I didn't. But they would pull you over for any little thing. Sometimes they would just get behind you and follow you. And even though they never pulled you over, they would just follow you for like 3 or 4 miles. And not every time I got followed by the police did I get pulled over by the police. And so I can definitely understand why people find resentment towards that. And I can tell you that, that's why when there's a police shooting where a police officer shoots a person, I do not immediately think the police were right. I know people who do, but I don't. I say, let's see what happened. Now, I oftentimes don't come to the conclusion that the police were wrong. I think that, for example, when Michael Brown in Ferguson was shot, I think that was a justifiable shooting. But I also understand the resentment of the people in that community. If you look to that community and you realize the police would go and they would follow people and talk to them when all they're trying to do is go to frickin' work, that they were annoyed by the police. And the other thing that happened was oftentimes in places like Ferguson is they had a municipal court system. A system of courts that all they could do was levy fines against people of $100, $200, $300, $500. And so they'd pull somebody over, they'd give them a ticket and want $200. Well, if you don't have much money, $200 is not an easy thing to pay. And when you couldn't pay it, what would they do? They would throw them in jail for 2 days for contempt of court. And it was an extremely big system. But it was all those who had the money and could just pay the fine. They're like, "Oh, what's the big deal?" Well, they also weren't getting pulled over because they weren't in the bad neighborhoods and they weren't being targeted. But the other thing is they could just pay the fine. And if the fine was higher, they would hire an attorney. And the attorney would go in and go, "We don't want this on their record. You think you could just make it disappear?" And they would, because the system was corrupt, and it still probably is corrupt. And so the case is you as a journalist have the ability to go in there and find those people who are misrepresented by it and give voice to them. And that's what you're supposed to do. Don't go out there and hold the water for those who have the power, who already have the frickin' hose. Your job is to go out there and find the people who are sucking water out of puddles and give them a voice. And that is why people become journalists. Don't go out there and and comfort the comfortable and afflict the afflicted. That's already what happens. You need to be vigilant, courageous, and hold those in power to account. And oftentimes those in power, as much as we like them, I have people who have run for political office. I have a certain amount of power. I work for the government. I make a decent living. I am not a person who is afflicted by a large degree. I am a professor. I have a bully pulpit. I am sitting here talking to my computer loudly, and I expect people will be listening to me. Because why? Because if you don't, you're not going to get credit for this, right? And so I understand that. But what happens is I am not a bad person. And most people aren't, but there are those who are bad. And as a journalist, our job is to find them and hold them to account. One last example of this is, there was a town in California. I always forget the name of it. But the people in the mayor and the council and the police chief, everybody, they were working these part-time jobs. And the mayor was getting like $200,000 for a part-time job of a town of 20,000 to be the mayor. And the police chief was getting like $250,000. The fire chief was getting like $250,000. At the same time, the police chief of LA, which was only a few miles away, and had 50 times as many people in it, had more than 1 million, whereas this town had 20,000, was making $100,000. The fire chief in LA was making less. The council members were each making like $100,000 for what was essentially a 5-hour a week job. But they would vote in these pay raises, and they would do this stuff in a town that was pretty much a working class town. And they would put out sales tax, they would do everything, and they wouldn't, they weren't necessarily fixing the street or providing new infrastructure or doing other things. Instead, they were paying themselves these grossly overinflated salaries. And they got away with it because nobody bothered to go, I wonder what they're paying these people. That's your job as a journalist, to look at that and to give that information and let the people know. Give voice to the voiceless. Hold those in power to account. When it finally came out, this was such a gross abuse of it, it was ridiculous. Now, there's nothing wrong with a person who is a skilled attorney, skilled police chief, skilled politician to get paid a reasonably decent wage. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when you're getting 3-4 times what everybody else in a like position is making, and everybody's doing this, then it becomes a question. And that's what what journalists should do, is be holding those people to account.